Hey, welcome to Considering Christianity. My name is Brad Sarian. I'm a lead pastor with Restored LA. We are a church that meets in Northridge in Los Angeles, and I'm also, I think I consider myself an amateur philosopher. And so with those two worlds combined, I was really excited to put together this video series. I got my degree at Cal State Northridge in philosophy. I minored in religious studies. I love thinking. I love debating and talking and just really wrestling through big ideas, understanding how faith plays a part of life and reason and logic and science and history and all those worlds together. And so I'm putting this video series together, maybe a couple months long. I'm going to try to release 2 videos a week. And really what we're going to be looking at is the worldview of Christianity, the Christian understanding of how we view the world, and whether or not it is comprehensive, whether or not it can really answer life's biggest questions. And this is for non-Christians. If you're watching in, whether you're secular, agnostic, Mormon, Muslim, whatever you are, just for you maybe to be able to peek in via YouTube, kind of a safe place, and just see what is this Christianity actually about. And for the Christian, for those of you who want to grow in your understanding of Christianity and be able to articulate it and explain it better to neighbors or friends or family members who may be wondering. And so with the COVID-19 pandemic, this has just been an opportunity that I thought would be helpful to utilize the gift of YouTube and just kind of throw something out there and say, hey, if this is helpful, use it as best you can, however you would like. And so I really am excited to dive in. I'm probably going to focus quite a bit on just the secular worldview over these videos. I grew up in a Christian church, Christian school, kind of a Christian bubble. I didn't become a Christian until I was 20 years old, but I kind of grew up in that Christian circle. And throughout the course of my entire life, with the hundreds, if not thousands of acquaintances, I've actually never known anyone who later in life converted to Mormonism, Buddhism, Hinduism, any other religion. And that's not to say people aren't doing that. Millions are. But I've never met them in Los Angeles. And what is more the story of Los Angeles, of America, is more of a Christian subculture. It used to be a Christian nation. Not really, but people thought that the majority of people would check the box, Christian. I think what we're really seeing is a move toward a secular worldview. Secular just meaning non-religious, that would maybe check the box of I'm not affiliated with a religion. And so that's who these videos are probably going to be more geared toward. Wherever you're at, hopefully you'll be able to learn some stuff. But out of my hundreds or thousands of acquaintances, the majority of people I know have drifted away from a Christian bubble, Christian circle, into that secular worldview. I'm just kind of gone, I'm not really into that. I'm going to kind of do my own thing. And so today, what I really want to do is just lay a foundation as we jump into weeks coming up around considering Christianity from a historical perspective, scientific perspective, an ethical, philosophical, sexual, physical bodies and emotional bodies, just kind of looking at all these different aspects, even politically. What does it look like a Christian worldview applied to all these fields of science or learning and ideologies and philosophies? And so I'm excited for it. But today, the main thing I really want to get across is that everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. That word worldview may not be the coolest word in the world, but it really is helpful. And really, if you just take the world view and you switch it around, it's your view of the world. And what a worldview is it's understanding that the way you view the world, when you wake up and you begin your day, it's different than the way your spouse or your roommate or your friends or family members or someone on the other side of the world views the world. We look at the world with a specific lens in answering some of the biggest questions of why am I here? What's my purpose? How did I get here? What's right and wrong? What will make me ultimately happy and fulfilled in this life? That's a worldview. It's how you answer those. And some of us have actually taken time to write out what our worldview is. Maybe you align with a religion or a philosophy that it's actually kind of mapped out for you. But even if you haven't spent the time writing something out, you still have a worldview. And so one of the things that philosophers give an example of is a worldview is kind of like a set of glasses. Now, don't judge me, but I just bought these this past week because of just working from home and being on Zoom calls far more than usual about my blue light blocking glasses. And so these glasses, as I put them on, they really do, they're a good example of a worldview. They've got like a yellow tint on them. They're blocking those dangerous blue light rays or whatever it is. And everything's a little yellow with those glasses. Maybe they're not a good pair, I don't know. But that's how I view the world. And all of us have a set of glasses on in which we view the world, and it answers those deep questions for us. Yet the reality is, these glasses are new for me, and so I'm very aware of them when they're on my face. I take them off the moment I turn away from a screen. They aren't that comfortable. My wife says I have too big of a head for them, but I'm aware of them. But we are rarely aware of our worldview. In fact, maybe contact lenses would be a better example of what a worldview looks like. We don't see them on. It's just how we still see the world, and they're answering those big questions. And here's the thing. Every worldview has difficulties, right? Including the Christian worldview. Every worldview has difficulties, including the Christian worldview. And this is one of the things I think many Christians do make a mistake on. I think sometimes if Christians are talking to non-Christians, they act as if the Christian worldview, the way that Jesus had kind of established the Judeo-Christian world, that it's just simple, it's obvious, like you should just get it. And I think that's unhelpful, because even the Christian worldview has difficulties with it that can't answer everything perfectly. It's not to say there aren't the right answers or the truthful answers. I believe there are, but it's hard for us to understand some difficult things. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of evil. It is a problem. God loves everybody. He's all powerful. He's in control of the world. Why is there such a mess in the world, right? That's a good question. It's a difficulty in the Christian worldview. But every single worldview has a problem. It all has different types of difficulties. So what we're trying to do is not ask the question which worldview is perfectly flawless and answers everything we can understand completely, because I don't think that exists. We're humans, and we just don't have that ability. So the question really is, which worldview corresponds closest to reality, right? One of my favorite definitions of truth is that which corresponds to reality. Sometimes in our culture we're like, well, what is truth? Well, truth is anything that relates to reality, anything that is corresponding to the way we experience reality. And so a quick example would be 2 + 2 = 4, right? Why does 2 + 2 = 4? Does it equal 4 because in kindergarten your teacher told you 2 + 2 is 4, just memorize it, don't doubt it, just know that? No. We could go out into the front yard right now, and I could gather 2 sticks and then another 2 sticks and lay them out on a sidewalk, and then we could count 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 + 2 = 4 because it corresponds to reality. And so a worldview, what we're looking for in understanding the way our world works, is a worldview that corresponds to reality, that actually makes sense of our experiences. So imagine if you had 2 guys, Walt and Ed, and Walt had just become convinced. He has a new worldview, he's excited about it, he's got a YouTube channel, all this stuff, blogging a lot about it, that he is convinced that humans flourish and can breathe underwater. Okay? And he's got his buddy Ed. He's like, Ed, you've got to believe me. We're meant to live underwater. We can breathe underwater. Now, Ed could test that worldview to see if it's true. All Ed has to do is jump into a pool, get to the bottom of the deep end, and then take a deep breath. What would happen? He'd begin choking, maybe drown, possibly die. Would not be good, right? And immediately, Ed would be able to look at Walt and go, your worldview is not true. It does not correspond to reality. You said I can do this, that I can breathe underwater. I tried doing that. It doesn't work that way. And so what we're really seeking as human beings is a worldview that's comprehensive, that makes the most sense of reality. But that means that we have to be able to evaluate the different worldviews that we're in. And there's the next main thing I want to explain is that you cannot reject one worldview without embracing another worldview. You cannot reject one worldview without embracing another worldview. And this is one of the greatest myths of our current culture. We often talk about walking away from the faith. If you're maybe grew up in a Christian culture, Christian church, Christian family, and you have just drifted from that. The narrative of that is you were in this set of beliefs and this faith system, and then you just walked away into something else. And I watched this recently. Rhett and Link are two kind of famous YouTubers. And they grew up in the Christian church. They worked with Campus Crusade, kind of Christians, paid Christians on staff. And recently in their YouTube videos, they shared their deconversion stories, their deconstruction stories. And Rhett's story was really interesting. He says this at one point in his story. He says, "I kind of saw Christianity as this boat in a very stormy sea. It's stable. There's a lot of other people on it. It's got a destination. You're going to get through this. It gives you something to hold on to. It gives you stability. It gives you purpose. It gives you direction. And it gives you community. And when I jumped ship, I didn't jump to another boat. I jumped into the water. And I pulled my wife and my children with me. I jumped into a sea of uncertainty. And that's where I've lived for about 6 years." Okay? So this is part of that secular myth. I was on this one boat, and I jumped off the boat into the ocean of uncertainty. But realistically, what Rhett did is he jumped off the boat of Christianity onto another boat. If you jump into the ocean, you die. You can't just chill in the ocean forever. He jumped off one boat into another boat. And if that boat may not have a perfect name or a title or a label for that philosophy, it still is a worldview. It's still answering the questions of life that he needs answered. And maybe he went from the Christian worldview, going, here's the purpose of life, to enjoy God and live for him. And now I'm jumping off that boat. He's ultimately jumping onto another boat that says the purpose of life is not that. The purpose of life, maybe we don't know what the purpose of life is, but that is a worldview in and of itself. It isn't this walking away from faith. It's walking into a different set of faith. And so every worldview has these difficulties, and you can't step away from one or reject one without embracing another worldview. And so I want to show you a diagram. I'm going to do my best to explain this via iPad, and if we can get real fancy, we'll see how I can do this. But it's called a web of beliefs. And I heard this years ago, and I think it's really helpful. The Christian and the secular, they're both worldviews. They're both have beliefs as a foundation. And each of these belief systems have different webs that really give a foundation, that give you an ability to go, I can stand firmly on this worldview. So the Christian worldview, like the secular, imagine each one of these lines I'm going to be drawing. It represents a line that kind of answers one of those big questions of life. It helps make sense of the world we live in. Imagine this one, right here. We'll just call this one, it stands for justice. I believe every human being has this innate desire for justice. We hate when justice comes for us, but we can't stand when someone robs from us, when someone steals from us, someone lies to us, someone cheats us. There's this innate rage, there's this innate desire for justice for the other person. The Christian worldview has a good answer for that. We're made in the image of a just God. He actually is just himself, so we're representatives of him in that, and also God's going to, everyone who's going to die is going to meet him, and he's going to bring justice. And so the Christian worldview can even say things like the Apostle Paul says in Romans, like we don't even have to avenge ourselves because God's going to do that. In fact, rarely are we really good judges at bringing justice. We usually go a little too far. We can trust God with that. So that's one way. Another line would maybe be a web of belief for us is just how is there something rather than nothing, right? What's the answer to that? And the Christian worldview would say, well, God created everything. He's immaterial, and he created a material world. That's how we have a material world. It's from God. So each one of these things can represent, and we can keep going, and ultimately what these next 16 or so weeks are going to be are different lines of these things answering these questions. And the secular worldview has the same things, right? They've got a web of beliefs that help them live their life and answer those big questions. Why am I here? What's my purpose in life? All those kinds of things. And so maybe a couple good examples for those is the season we find ourselves in, COVID-19. A secular person can very well just write a line and go, look, the Christians say that there's a God who loves us, is in control, and he's good. Look at the mess that our world is in. I don't know if that's actually true. Look at this. And so they'll write that and go, it seems like nobody is really in control. It seems like this world may be left up to chance. And so they'll write that down as a web of belief. Another one they could write down is like, look at how many religions there are in the world. Who's arrogant enough to say this is the right way, right? So the secular person can go, I'm stepping away from all these religions and saying, I don't fully know. So they've got all these. But now here's the issue that I've found is oftentimes when the person maybe walks away from a Christian worldview or just has never been a Christian and just kind of lived a life of agnosticism or atheism, the secular person is pretty good at pointing holes at the Christian worldview, which I've already addressed. There are difficulties with the Christian worldview. So let's say this: the secular person points out, oh, look at this hole in the Christian worldview. Right here you have this, and we'll call this maybe the difficulty of the problem of evil for the Christian. Right? I mentioned it earlier that the life is, God is good, He loves us, He's in control, He's all powerful, and yet look around. I mean, people are dying. Life is hard. There's so much suffering. Like the secular person could go, I don't know if your web of beliefs is actually good. So they point the hole out right there. And let's go with an example. I just finished reading Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived 3 different Nazi death camps in World War II. Just horrendous stories of life in death camps. And so as I'm reading them, as a Christian, I'm reading these going, God, where were you? What are you doing? This is really difficult to answer. Now listen, we'll do a whole week on the problem of evil and suffering, because I do believe that the Christian worldview gives the most comprehensive answer, but it still isn't perfect. It still isn't like, oh, that's okay, that's why the Holocaust happened. It still leaves us in a sense of just this is hard to understand. And so the secular person does a decent job going, look at that. But what the Christian needs to be able to understand is that the Holocaust didn't happen just in a Christian worldview. The Holocaust happened, period, in human history. And the same problem of evil for the Christian is also a gaping hole for the secular person. The secular person has to explain the problem of evil as well. And then it becomes a conversation of whose worldview makes the most sense of evil, right? Like the secular person it's easy to point holes in somebody else's worldview and go, see, that's a problem. And similar to Rhett's story, see, he poked holes into the Christian worldview and then he jumped into the ocean. No, he poked holes into the Christian worldview and jumped onto another boat that he believes answers more of these questions more accurately, that correspond to truth. And so ultimately, what I think is the secular person has a really difficult time with the problem of evil. The secular person has to look at the Holocaust and just go, well, it's a bummer, it's awful, it's horrendous, but that's just life. Like that, bad things happen, there are bad people in the world, and man, just that's what happened, right? Like there can't be any redemptive purpose in it. It's just meaningless, and it took place. And so the secular person has a real big difficulty with that. And you could even use an example, a 4-year-old girl who gets cancer and dies. Is that a problem with the Christian worldview? Yeah. How do we make sense of something that horrific? We don't, but we have answers at least that could go, well, at least she can be reunited with her family one day because of the resurrection of Jesus, that death isn't the end. That longing for eternity, a Christian worldview actually gives an answer to. But for the secular person, they still have 4-year-old girls dying of cancer in their worldview. And you have to answer that. You have to go, well, what's my answer? And your answer might be, well, that just is, it's a bummer, and it happens, and that's just life. That's just not a compelling answer. It may be true. I'm not saying it's just because it feels better it's true, but I am saying that you can't just poke holes in somebody else's worldview without embracing the same issues in your worldview and trying to give a comprehensive answer to it. So with all of that, I think what really it does come down to is that whichever worldview corresponds closest to reality is worthy of embracing. That every worldview has difficulties. The Christian worldview, the atheist worldview, the agnostic worldview, every worldview has some difficulties in it. But it really comes down to which one's the most correspond, which seems to correspond the most to reality. Because what we have are our senses, we have our experiences, we have our desires. And most often our experiences can be trusted. Occasionally we shouldn't trust our experiences. We've all had dreams where you wake up and you're like, oh, that felt so real, and I'm so glad that's not true. That can happen, but by and large, we can trust our experiences. When I'm driving on the freeway, I don't need to constantly be doubting my vision. Are those real cars next to me? Are those illusions? What's going on? I can see a car next to me and go, okay, I need to wait till it passes to go. And so I can do that. I can trust my experiences. I can trust my senses. And it's in those things that we begin to understand what this world looks like and which worldview corresponds most to reality. I'll end with a quote by C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite philosophers and theologians. Lewis picks up on this idea of desires and says this: creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So Lewis says, man, we've got these desires in us, and because we have these desires, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get it. I get hungry. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to eat. I could die of starvation, but it certainly means that food exists, or else where else would this desire come from? And so over the next 18 or so, 16 weeks, we're going to be looking at different worldviews, the Christian worldview applied to different areas of life, and really asking, does Christianity make the most sense of the world? Despite some of its difficulties, we're going to address some of those things. Does it still make the most sense of the world? Because you can't jump out of one boat into the ocean. You simply jump from one boat to another boat, to another boat, to another boat. So we're really looking for the boat that makes the most sense of the world, that's actually on track, going to get us to the final destination that we understand that this world was ultimately created for. So I want to leave you just with a few discussion questions, just for you to maybe journal, to think through. And here's the first one. How do you answer the most basic questions of life? How do you answer those most basic questions of life? Whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, I think it's really important for you to be able to write those down. Like what am I here for? Why am I here? How did I get here? What's ultimately going to make me happy? How do I define what's right and wrong? Where did I get that idea? What's wrong with the world? Can it be fixed? How do we fix it? Those big questions in life are the worldview questions, and how do you answer those things? I am convinced personally that the Christian worldview answers those in the most compelling way, that God created us for himself, he shared his love with us so that we could enjoy his love and give his love to others, that the world is broken though. We've sinned, we've turned against him, we've kind of wandered to be our own gods, and that's what messed up this world that we're living in. But Jesus can fix it, and he's going to ultimately fix it. And through his death and resurrection, that he's offered this hope to all of us, that we can now be saved, we can now be reconciled back to him and enjoy what he created in the first place. And so, does it answer everything perfectly? Maybe not, but I'm convinced it answers the most basic questions of life in a very, very compelling way. So how do you answer the most basic questions of life? Number 2 is, how did you come to those conclusions? It is important. Maybe just the Bible, maybe your parents, maybe that professor at university. How did you come across those conclusions? Maybe it was a YouTube video. How did you come across the conclusions of answering those questions? And lastly is this: do your answers match the way you actually live? If not, why not? And this is why this is really important. It's easier to actually write down answers. What's the purpose of life? Oh, there is no purpose of life. It's easy to answer questions, but then you have to evaluate your life and go, is this how I'm actually living? Am I corresponding with the reality in this? And if my answer to the purpose of life question is there is no purpose of life, and yet I have this deep, deep desire and this unshakable feeling that there is a purpose to my life, like I'm not meaningless, then your worldview needs to adapt to that to make the most sense of the reality that you find yourself living in. So I hope that we can continue these conversations. I think next week we'll chat about science, and then we'll be talking about philosophy and history and politics and the physical body and the sexual body and emotional body and all those things. And so I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope to see you soon.